be joining the webinar today as well.
Okay, we're live, Emily.
Brilliant. Well, hello and welcome everybody to this Emerging Minds webinar. My name's Emily and I'm really delighted to be joined by three brilliant panellists who I'll introduce a bit more further, but you'll see their smiling faces there. So we'll talk a bit more about our panellists shortly. But yes, as you know, this webinar is really going to be focusing on the return to school and what research tells us about how we might be able to best support children and young people in that kind of journey. We're working with the Mental Elf today, and so this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube. So if you are joining us on YouTube, you can comment and join in the discussions there. If you are joining us in the Zoom webinar, you can join in the chat and also ask us questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there. So I really wanted to emphasise that all of the materials that we discussed today in the slides will be available afterwards, and we will be sharing the recordings of the whole webinar and also the talks from our speakers on the Mental Health YouTube channel and also on the Emerging Minds website. So that will be a chance to catch up or share with colleagues later. So just to give you a quick rundown then of what to expect. So we'll be first hearing from Professor Tamsin Ford from the University of Cambridge. Tamsin's really going to focus on what research can tell us about whole school approaches. So drawing on some major studies that Tamsin has led, focused on promoting good mental health and supporting mental health in schools. We'll then be hearing from Dr. Polly Waite from the University of Oxford in Reading, and Polly's going to share findings and some of the implications from a recent review of research focused on children who find attending school difficult or impossible, and highlighting some hot off the press findings from the current and ongoing CoSpace study. And then we're delighted also to be joined by Fran Morgan from Square Peg. And Square Peg works for national change for those who find attending school difficult. And Fran will be sharing the perspective of the parents that she works with on how we might best support children who might find returning to school particularly difficult. So without further ado then, as I say, just please do share any comments or questions with us either on YouTube or through the Zoom webinar as we go through it. But I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker, Professor Tamsin Ford from the University of Cambridge. So Tamsin is Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and her research focuses on the organisation, delivery and effectiveness of services and interventions for children and young people's mental health. So warm welcome to you, Tamsin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Can I just check that everyone can see my slides? So if the rest of the panel can, that's good. So please don't feel you need to take notes. As Emily said, everything, including the references behind the research, will be available with a copy of my slides at the end of the webinar. And I'm going to talk, I hope, in a way that's reassuring. We're all in uncharted times. Our lives, for all of us, teachers, mental health practitioners, researchers, have completely changed. And that is anxiety provoking, but that the level of anxiety needs to be contained, because for most of us, it won't be a pathological level of anxiety. So I wanted first to highlight the fact that actually we know a lot, and a lot of you are doing amazing things in schools that support the social and emotional development of your pupils and their mental health. At the risk of teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, I would point you at the department, the Public Health England whole school approach document. It's referenced with a link to it in the references, and that highlights the things that schools can do to optimize the mental health of their students. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I'm going to pull out certain highlights. It was led by Public Health England, but also with the support of the Children and Young People's Mental Health Alliance, which is a broad coalition of third sector organisations working in this space. The other very useful piece of research that I'd like to point you at is a systematic review that I and colleagues from Exeter led in relation to behaviour. Now, sometimes people split off behaviour and feel that it's not really mental health, it's something different. I would argue against that. Behaviour is often a communication. And also children who struggle with their behaviour to the point that it causes problems for them, their family or their school, they have an increased risk of every mental health condition there is in adulthood. So difficult behaviour is something that's very toxic to children's development. This practitioner report, there's a short practitioner report because we know that teachers and other people working in schools are hugely busy. And then there's a much more detailed publication, both available on the Education Endowment Foundation's website, which gives you the science. And in fact, there were 3 linked systematic reviews where we systematically searched the literature. And the key recommendations are, you know your pupils. Make sure you try and understand their influences, and I'll explain that a bit more in a minute, because for some of them you'll have a very good idea of who your vulnerable pupils are, but there may be some people who've got some additional vulnerabilities. Teaching learning behaviours rather than purely focusing on discipline. The evidence base for supporting behaviour in schools is around the promotion of good behaviour. That's where there is evidence, and there is growing evidence. There is no evidence to support very discipline, punishment focused approaches. That's not to say that I'm saying there shouldn't be consequences for misbehaviour, but you will do better by your children if you focus on encouraging the positives. This doesn't need to be expensive. I'm in a minute going to talk about a particular training course, but there are lots of simple things that you can do. For those who struggle, you are going to need to be a bit more targeted, but actually it's more of the same. And consistency with individuals and across the school is absolutely essential. So coming back to the influences, behaviour is on a spectrum from more negative to more desirable, and the influences on children's behaviour and indeed their mental health can be both positive and negative, and those kind of interact. So where we hope most people is in this part of the diagram with lots of positive influences like social relationships and abilities to do things and integrated into clubs, and that hopefully will lead to good mental health and better behaviour. But things happen, life happens, and this epidemic's happened, and that's probably shoved most of us towards this corner with a few more negative influences, like maybe anxiety about catching the infection, maybe families have been directly affected by the infection, there may be worries about income, etc. So just being aware of the influences that your children in your school are struggling with is important. But I would urge schools, and this is broken down in more detail in the report, to focus on what you can manage directly. I think there is often a pressure on schools to take responsibility for absolutely everything. And whilst you might want to be aware of things like domestic violence, you have a legal duty to, or the way culture might not fit terribly well with the culture of the school, you can't be expected to change it, and you could certainly not responsible for it on your own. There are legal, statutory, safeguarding things you'd have to do, but we're not saying focus on that. Focus on relationships in the school, teacher-pupil, and re-establishing peer groups, and being very careful of those who are socially isolated. Bullying is probably our most tractable public mental health risk factor. It casts a shadow over childhood mental health as well as adult mental health. These are the things that teachers can do. And then in the middle, there's a whole load of things that can have an influence that you might be able to do a little bit about, but it's not primarily your responsibility. I'm now going to talk about the approach to behaviour management in classrooms, which has the most evidence. And this is what's called a logic model, which I'll break down for you from the trial we ran. So we tested as far as we could using schools in Devon as an experiment where half of them got the intervention and half of them didn't. This course for teachers. Teachers came along for one day, for 6 whole days, but at 1 day at a time, spread out by a month, groups of 10 at a time. The idea was it was collaborative. The teachers are the experts in their context, and it was taking them through ways to be proactive in their behaviour management rather than reactive, and to plan the behaviour management plans around children who struggled in a way that supported better behaviour in the classroom. So how did we think it worked? Well, I think one thing we were not surprised about, but we're delighted to see, is most of the teachers found it very validating. They said, we know this stuff, but it's kind of giving us permission to experiment. It's giving us time and space to think about what we're doing. That if you then have a teacher who's calmer, feeling more confident, has strategies around the more tricky customers that they're dealing with, for individual children will then feel more settled, they're having a better time at school, their efforts to behave are being recognised. That in a class level feeds into a calmer class where people can work and the teacher is less stressed, and you get into a virtuous cycle. But of course, all this bit down here, the government, Ofsted, what's going on in society, obviously the COVID pandemic and what we've all just been through and the fears about things opening up feeds into that. But ideally, if you get that going, you will have better mental health in the pupils, in the teachers, and better attainment, better attendance and fewer exclusions down the line. Rather than me banging on about this, I want you to hear from one of the teachers who took part in our study. Oh, I think it might. It's not going to play. I'm very sorry. It's worked on practices. Again, I can point you to a website where you can see her. But what she says is the course helps you to shift your mindset in that you start noticing and picking up on the positives where children are doing what you want and responding to that rather than picking up on the negatives. And the negatives then fade away because the children are clearer about what they're supposed to be doing, and they feel, you know, they're getting the response. What we need to remember is just how rewarding adult attention is, and negative attention, being told off for stuff, may not feel rewarding to the teacher who's having to do it, or the parent who's having to nag, but actually it is attention and it is rewarding. The next point I want to make is that actually most kids are going to be doing fine. So these are strengths and difficulties questionnaires results from young people, from parents, and from teachers, from a massive survey in 2007 and 2004. There were nearly 8,000 children involved in this survey. You'll see that this graph, so a higher score is bad, and how high you're scoring is along the bottom line. So the kids here are scoring very highly, and the blue arrows are where the clinical cut point is. And what you will see is they're not two groups, those who are coping and those who are not. It's what scientists call a normal distribution, like height or weight. Most of us are in the middle. A few are really thriving, and a few are not doing so well. And whether you come outside that clinical cut point will depend very much on your support network, your psychological makeup, and the school environment. But the point I wanted to make is that, you know, COVID might have shifted us all a bit further to the right, although results in adults on a survey where they had baseline data before COVID suggests there was a spike, and then actually it's come back to normal. And within that, there will be different groups that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But actually, we shouldn't assume that everybody is traumatized. We've had to adjust, but we're designed to do so, and most people are doing fine. The groups that I would recommend being worried about as teaching practitioners, or indeed mental health practitioners, those with pre-existing mental health conditions, because it says something about their current resilience, and also services that normally support those children, be they third sector or the CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, in the NHS have had to move very rapidly to a different way of working. Now, for some people, actually, they're preferring it, but for other people, they may have experienced a drop in the support that they need. So be aware of who your vulnerable children are. Those who tend to be anxious or tend to get very sad, this might have been enough to tip them into a clinical episode. And school, sadly, can be a serious source of anxiety for some children. And we need to remember that for some children who struggle in school, either because academically it's tough or because they're anxious, socially anxious, or anxious about separation, two common reasons, they might actually have found it better at home. And quite often they struggle to get back into school after, say, half term or the summer holidays. They will have had a long time at home and they may really struggle to get back in after such a break. And they probably will need, some of them, some really careful thinking about how you break down the steps. Some of the children in our population will have had COVID-related adverse experiences. It's worthwhile noting that actually the infection, we know more in adults because more adults have got very poorly with this, but the infections in adult may have some direct effects on the brain. But also, if you've had to go into intensive care, it's a very unpleasant experience. And the study of children who were in intensive care for meningitis showed that most of them had post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards. There may be families under severe financial strain and children may have been bereaved. The other group are those with special educational needs, who you will know all about because you will have a register and you'll have plans in place. I think one group I'd particularly highlight are those with autism spectrum condition, for whom change and transitions are really, really hard. They will have found it very hard to cope in lockdown, and they will find it hard to come back into school, particularly as it's not only the transition, but the school they come back to will be different. Very last slide. This is from a study of children who are actually on their way to being excluded. And so the complex journey was how they coped at school coming up to that time. But I think actually we're all on a coping continuum, aren't we? We all cope better sometimes than we do other times. And just to say, whilst the home situation will impact on children's ability to cope, so does school. There is lots that schools can do to help. And it's about a positive ethos and knowing who might be struggling and knowing how much, knowing what you could put in to support the children who need a little bit of extra care. And that comes back to the original Public Health England report, but also the Know Your Pupils and Their Influences. And the final comment is, there are some children who are going to struggle anyway. Educationally or mental health, these children will need additional help. The vast majority of the school population will do just fine. And in between, there is this red vulnerable group. And that's where the strategies you put in health can make the difference, whether they end up back in the white group or the orange group. I'll stop there because we want time for questions and I don't want to run on. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. That's really, really helpful. So so if you do have questions or comments for Tamsin, and you are on the Zoom webinar, do add those into the chat box or the Q&A box. Just a reminder, if you are on the Zoom webinar, do share any comments with all panelists and all attendees, because some really good ideas popping up from participants that would be great to share. So I'd really like to introduce our next panellist, that's Dr. Polly Waite. So Polly is a senior clinical research psychologist at both University of Reading and Oxford. And Polly is a clinical psychologist by training and focuses her research on anxiety disorders in adolescents in particular. So thanks so much for joining us, Polly.
Thank you, Emily. And just to say, my internet just crashed while Tamsin was talking. Hopefully it will be fine, but if I suddenly disappear, it's likely to be related to that, but it all seems to be well at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how we support children and young people attending school during the pandemic, with particular focus on children who may be experiencing anxiety or worries. Oh, sorry. Move on to the next one. Okay, so when we're thinking about young people getting back into school in the current context, it might be helpful to draw on the literature of the 1 to 2% of children who find it difficult to attend school in non-pandemic situations, in the absence really of any literature that helps us know what to do in pandemic situations. This is probably the best that we've got right now. So let's start by thinking about the literature on risk factors, which demonstrate that school non-attendance is a really complex problem, which is determined by a broad range of risk factors that might be involved in both causing school non-attendance difficulty or school attendance difficulties, but also might be involved in maintaining the problem over time. And typically the researchers distinguish between those problems that relate to the individual child, their family environment, the school and the broader community. And so when we're thinking about individual child factors, we're thinking about things like anxiety, as Tamsin's already identified, particularly around generalized worries and separation anxiety, and then depression, other behavioural difficulties, as Tamsin again identified, children with special educational needs, and also children with physical illness. And that obviously relates to COVID or maybe non-COVID problems like asthma, where people might be concerned about their health in the context of coming back to school right now. And then there'll be family factors, and some of those are the same kind of factors you'd see within children. So they might relate to mental health or physical health difficulties, but some of them might relate to particular parenting styles. So parents that tend to be very hands-off and permissive, or the opposite end of the spectrum where they might be very overprotective. And then also particular experiences, life events that might relate to the family, and that might be things like bereavement, which might be more relevant again now, or other things like separation and those kind of factors. And then when we think about school factors, these kind of factors relate to things like peer difficulties, including bullying, academic difficulties, particular stressful things at school. So PE lessons are often a trigger point for school non-attendance. And things like transitions to secondary school or other moving on to other year groups or sixth form or other things like that. And obviously some of those school factors are risk factors for school non-attendance, but they're also risk factors for children having anxiety problems. And then finally, there are community factors, and these relate to things like feeling under pressure to achieve academically, or it might be things like a lack of resources, like CAMS or difficulty accessing help. And of course, I've presented them separately, but the reality is it's likely to be a complex interaction that may well change over time. And what's also interesting to be aware of is that although all of these factors appear to be important, there's some evidence that school staff in particular put quite a lot of emphasis on individual, family or peer factors as being more important than those that relate to the school environment. So it's particularly important to think about all the different factors that might be involved here. So if we are looking at what we should do with children that have difficulties attending school, there was a recent review in 2015 by Maynard, the references on the slide you can see, and actually interestingly identified only 8 studies of what we should do in terms of intervention. The majority of those studies involved cognitive behaviour therapy or CBT. So that's changing the way the young person thinks, changing what they do in order to break that vicious cycle of non-attendance. And interestingly, the components of treatment for school non-attendance are really very similar to the components of treatment that you'd see for an anxiety based intervention. So it's about helping the child become less anxious by doing things like facing their fears and testing out things that they're scared of, typically in a kind of graduated way that's done at a way that feels manageable for the child, sort of building up into more and more challenging situations. For children that have social anxiety, it might involve things like social skills training. And then the real push is to kind of take action rather than spend too much time in your head dwelling on problems. And where there are real life problems, so for example, where a child might be struggling with schoolwork or struggling with friendships, it's about problem solving and finding ways to deal with them. And what we also know from this literature is the importance of involving both the child, the school and the parent, and that combination is really, really important. And so from a parents and school point of view, it's important to, support the child to do things like be brave and face their fears, and lots of positive reinforcement around that. Discouraging them from avoiding as much as you possibly can, and maybe finding ways of sort of building things up slowly, but not letting the child not speak or not present in front of the class, but doing it in a way that feels manageable to kind of build up their confidence. Not providing excessive reassurance, and instead just kind of encouraging the child. When they are feeling distressed, dealing with it, but not inadvertently giving too much attention to anxious behaviour, and instead really trying to focus all the attention on brave behaviour. And similarly for parents, making sure that home isn't too rewarding a place for them to be, in order to encourage them to be in school. Okay, so I'd like you to bear that in mind as we now move on to look at the kind of fears that parents are reporting that their children have about returning to school right now in the context of the COVID pandemic. And so we've been collecting data through our CoSpace study, which is an online study in the UK. It's with parents and carers of young people, and it involves them filling in an online survey on a monthly basis. And also if the young person is an adolescent aged 11 or older, they can also fill in the survey too. Now, it's really important to say this is not a nationally representative sample at all. So, I'm going to present some data to you, and it's important to bear that in mind. So our sample consists mainly of mums. 75% of them are working, but it's a relatively highly educated group, so more so than you would expect from a nationally representative sample. But we're really interested in this because what we want to be able to do is to look at patterns and how things differ for different groups, but also importantly, how things differ over time. And so actually, we have over 700 of the families have a child with special educational needs. Over 350 of them have a child with an autistic spectrum disorder. So we can learn quite a lot from what they're saying. And for any of you that haven't taken part, I would love you to encourage families perhaps that you work with, or if you have a family yourself, to take part in this study. We're still recruiting, and you can see the link is on the top of that slide there. So what I'd like to present to you first of all is some data that we've collected just in the last week or so actually. So the government announcement of schools going back was on Sunday the 10th of May, and we put some questions into the survey 2 days later. So we've got data for about 10 days on what parents perceive their children to be worried about going back into school. So this is starting to look at the primary school age. Again, don't worry too much about looking at the percentages. It's really about understanding the areas of concern within our sample. But when we developed these questions, we did it with a lot of consultation with young people and families. So hopefully we're asking the right questions in the first place. So if I pull this up, I hope you can see, because the text's quite small on the bottom. So these aren't all the responses, but they're the seven responses that parents are reporting their children are most concerned about. So the top one is about going back to school and things being different and uncertain. And then that's followed by concerns about the enjoyable bits of school not going to happen. So things like, maybe you're looking forward to the Leavers disco, there was a school trip that was planned, there was the school play, all the fun bits, being able to play sports or other activities. So there are real worries about school just being really boring and work focused, and all the exciting bits not being there. There are worries about friendships, and these feature on two of the bars. So actually one is about not being back at school with your close friends, and then there's another one at the end which is about friendships changing while you've been away from school. And then there are worries sort of related to that about how you socially distance with your friends, and being able to hug them and play with them in the way that you might normally. And then our younger children appear to be more worried about being away from home now that they've been at home with their families and their pets and everyone for a couple of months. And also worrying about the transition to either a new class, a new group, or a new school. So although we can't report on our year sixes directly, it's likely that some of the parents are reflecting the worries that they might have about transitioning up to secondary school, and the way that might occur. Okay, so let's now move on to the secondary school data. This is a much smaller group. We've got at the moment more parents of younger children. So these parents are reporting on their 12 to 16-year-olds. And so if we look at the data that they're reporting, you can see in terms of the percentages, they're actually higher than our parents are reporting the worries with the primary school age. So it appears that our secondary school children are more concerned about going back to school. What's interesting is if we look at those 7 stresses, actually 5 of them are exactly the same worries that our younger children appear to have. And in fact, the top 2 are the same. So this worry about things being different and uncertain, and this worry about things not being enjoyable and those things not happening are the 2 primary concerns. But whereas the parents of children, younger children, are reporting worries about being away from home and about transition, the secondary school children appear to be more worried about things like catching coronavirus themselves and also being put under academic pressure. So what does this mean in terms of how we might help? So pulling all of what we know about helping children getting into school generally, but also addressing some of these specific concerns that children seem to have, working it at the individual child level, you know, we're looking at very many of those same kind of strategies if we're thinking about supporting children who might be anxious. So again, facing and testing out fears, you know, taking action and problem solving and dealing with things rather than overly dwelling on them. But given the concerns that children appear to have about friendships and things being the same, clearly connecting with other children and doing fun things are going to be really important. And in terms of parents and school staff, then again, it's about everybody doing, you know, working together in a really joined up way, normalizing the uncertainty. We're all coping with huge amounts of uncertainty at the moment, and that's normal. And maybe we can learn some skills about how we can cope in these uncertain environments, but that's going to be normal. And it's important that, you know, early on, given the #1 concern seems to be about things being different, for schools and parents to provide to their children information that how things will be the same. You know, they'll still be with their same teacher, you know, the classroom might be the same, you know, might have registration, but perhaps they won't have assemblies or other things. That's going to be really important in preparing them, helping them see what they can control and what they can expect. Obviously validating their emotions, and that's not just anxiety, but frustration, feeling sad about things that you've missed. But trying to kind of set a really calm, non-panicky example will be important. It's obviously going to be important to talk about COVID-related worries, and especially amongst our secondary school young people who might be particularly concerned about it. And this provides an opportunity for teachers and parents to correct any inaccurate information, and also think with young people about things like how might they do social distancing. But again, in order to help feel uncertain and things being predictable, providing structure, providing enjoyable activities, making sure that friendships are supported and there's plenty of time to spend with your friends reconnecting. And then finally, it's about ensuring that academic needs are met too. And hopefully we can pick up on some of these points in the question and answer. So that's my last slide for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Polly. Thank you. Brilliant. So just a quick reminder before we hand over to Fran, there's some brilliant suggestions, examples of practice that people are sharing in the chat box for those on the Zoom webinar. We will gather together all of those recommendations and post those on the Emerging Minds website afterwards. And if you do have anything to share, just make sure you share it with all panelists and attendees, because a lot of them, I'm sure many people would benefit from. So without further ado then, I'm really happy to welcome Fran Morgan. Fran is the founder of Square Peg and also Not Fine in School, which is the kind of sister organisation I'm sure Fran will say a bit more about. But as I mentioned earlier, Square Peg affects national change for those with school attendance difficulties. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to hand over to Fran. Oh, Fran, we can't hear you. I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Fran.
So sorry. I'm going to go back one. So I'm going to talk about returning to school from the point of view of parents whose children perhaps had already been struggling with school attendance. And as Emily said, I run an organisation called Square Peg, which is about trying to affect change for those children and for their families, both in the short term, but also in the longer term in terms of how we approach education going forwards. And I work really closely with another parent-led group called Not Fine in School, which supports and empowers parents and provides information for parents and schools. Sorry, bear with me. I just wanted to say a bit about Not Fine in School because it's an amazing group. There is a closed Facebook group for parents, which has nearly 12,000 members today. It was growing at a rate of about 500 to 600 members a month pre-pandemic. Interestingly, very few member requests since the lockdown. I think a lot of the members will find that their children are responding really well to being at home and working at home. There's also a parallel closed Facebook group for professionals, and there's a fantastic website with loads of resources at notfineinschool.org.uk, and I can recommend it. So I talk about school refusal, but I wanted to say initially that it's actually not refusal, it's just the term that's most commonly recognised. It's really about can't and not won't, and that's such an important distinction. It was a growing problem before this pandemic for many, many reasons, which I won't go into here. And I think absence and exclusion are really just two sides of the same coin around unmet need. Quite often the response to school refusal exacerbates the problem because there's a real urgency to get a child back to school. There are quite punitive messages for parents. And really, we don't know the scale of the problem because the statistics, the official statistics, only measure persistent absence. So that's children missing 10% or more of school. And they don't really look at the underlying reasons, which, as others, as Tamsin and Polly have already said, are really complex. But the numbers, I think, are quite shocking. So 783,000 persistent absentees, 385,000 who miss about half a term of school, and 53,700 who miss half a year or so. So they completely dwarf, actually, the statistics for exclusion. So things that help. I think trust is absolutely fundamental because this is a three-way relationship when there are school attendance difficulties between child, parent and school. And the only way that we will resolve these is with good, established, trusted relationships. I think there's still a lack of understanding and awareness around school refusal, and we need to acknowledge that school attendance difficulties are real, and the level of difficulty and stress and worry for all those around the child when it happens. We need to try and identify the underlying causes if possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes a child can't engage. Sometimes they won't know what the problem is. And as adults, we're always looking for the problem so that we can find solutions. It's not always possible. Others have said this too, working in partnership with a child and the family is essential to find the sorts of strategies and interventions that will work in individual cases. Every case is different. So what works for one child won't work for another. And we can't just put blanket formulaic interventions in place. I think it's really important to recognise that small things can make a big difference, and that works both ways. So a small incident can be blown up into something which really escalates a child's anxiety and can lead to school refusal. But conversely, individual teachers can do the smallest things that make a massive difference to enable that child to come into school or come back into school after being away. So we have to be supportive. And we have to recognise that sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and we just have to recognise that it might go that way. I think we have to be flexible and creative in the support strategies and think a bit outside the box, particularly in these times. And a whole school trauma or ACEs aware approach is going to benefit all children. So Square Peg and Not Fine in School ran a survey back in April over 3 days. We had about 790 respondents. Mostly, I think, would have been parents of school refusers. And we asked them what their concerns were about going back to school. We asked them what options and what support they'd like to see. And then we asked them about longer term changes that they would like within the education system. So in terms of their concerns, the overriding concern was that their child might get COVID-19 and be ill. And I suspect that was partly about their child being ill, but also about their child bringing that illness back into what might be a vulnerable household. Second behind that was the need for mental health support. So 32% of parents said they rated that as either their number 1 or their number 2 concern. And 55% of parents thought their children would struggle actually to go back to school. 18% maybe initially, 37% would probably have more difficulties. In terms of the support that they were looking for, flexibility was the overriding request. And that comes in all shapes and forms: flexi schooling, community learning hubs, a mixture of online learning and at school, and generally just a much more flexible attitude within schools and academies. They wanted additional mental health support, and the obvious things, I guess, around coronavirus, the testing and contact tracing and a vaccine. And alarmingly, 23% said that they would home educate after lockdown ends. And I think that's probably driven by seeing a child who was previously really distressed, really anxious, suddenly more relaxed, happier, and ironically, potentially learning more. Because I think it's worth saying, just because a child is in school doesn't mean that they're in a position to learn, because if they're distressed, they're not going to be able to learn. And then in terms of longer term requests, if you like, 90% wanted to see a broader range of educational provision on offer. 73% wanted really radical reform to the education system, with another 23% wanting smaller improvements. And a large proportion, 84%, wanting to see these online resources that have become available more permanently available. So this report and this summary sheet, I think, will be sent to you all afterwards, and they're on the Not Fine in School website. So just to finish, I think this is a once in a lifetime almost opportunity to reassess how we do some of these things. And we talk about a new normal, things have to be different when we go back. I think it's really important to recognise the reality of school refusal. It's really complex. It's a global problem. There's now an international network that looks at these issues, and there are no quick fixes, unfortunately. We need to prioritise a recovery curriculum, trauma-aware, whole school approach. It has to come from school leadership down. We need to concentrate on relationships, on honesty, accountability, and trust. And we need to treat this return to school as another transition, like other transitions. So children have adapted to the change of working from home, and now they've got to adapt to another change. And I think there's a real concern about the lack of time to prepare, and the focus on all the practicalities means that some of this stuff might take second priority. I think there's a real need to develop online provision, but we must have equity of access. We must have engaging content. It's a completely different medium, and it needs to be interactive, because that opens up so much more opportunity for one-to-one teaching and feedback, relationships with parents, socializing with classmates, that sort of thing. It's been said already, but the adults around children, if we can support the teachers and parents, that will in turn reduce children's anxiety. We need to be flexible and supportive, because zero tolerance policies won't work. They just won't work. We need to expect and anticipate different types of behaviour, challenging behaviour, but also masking and withdrawal, which quite often is hard to spot or give time to. And we need to equip individual teachers, because they can play a really crucial role in school attendance difficulties, but they need training and they need agency to be able to respond appropriately with the children that they know and the families that they know. And then I think there's got to be individual choice. So from head teachers to parents, everyone is in a different, they all have unique circumstances, and everyone has to weigh up the risks and the benefits and be able to make an informed decision. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks so much, Fran, for that. That was really, really helpful. So for those in the Zoom webinar, I really recommend taking a look at the question and answer box. So there's some really interesting questions in there, but there's also some questions that have been answered. So I see Tamsin has been busy answering questions as other panelists have been chatting. So so as well as the questions, some of those answers there might be helpful, and we'll find a way to kind of share that as well on our website afterwards. And just a quick reminder, there's some absolutely brilliant comments and suggested resources coming through on the chat box as well, so do make sure you share that with all attendees so everyone can benefit from it. So before we tackle a couple of questions, I'm just going to quickly just say a little bit about what else is coming up from Emerging Minds. There's quite a few questions coming up that might be tackled by some other sessions we've got coming up. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. So what have I got here? Sorry, I'm the least organised. So can everybody see my screen okay? Great. Okay, so so really I just wanted to say a quick word to encourage you all to consider getting involved with the Emerging Minds Network. So please do, if you'd like to hear more about this type of event, sign up and join our mailing list. We're a research network working across sectors and disciplines, focused on children and young people's mental health. So do please consider getting involved. We really would like to echo Polly's encouragement to consider getting involved in our co-space study and also our co-spy study. So this is really for parents and carers of children age from 2 right up to 16, and you can see the links there. Again, we'll share this with you afterwards. We've also got a really useful resource on our website, which is particularly focused around how we can best support children and young people with worries and fears and anxiety. That's a PDF that's translated into over 15 different languages that you can access. And yes, and coming up next week, we've got 2 brilliant webinars. One is focused on sleep, so supporting particularly teenagers that might be having problems with their sleep during this current time. And also one particularly relevant for those of you who work in school, focused on play. So kind of tackling, we talked a little bit today about the importance of play for children's mental health at this time, but you know, how exactly can we achieve that given the restrictions that that we know schools are going to be under. So that will be a really interesting one, and all of it really focuses on trying to bring what we know from research to current practice. You can find recordings from the previous 5 sessions we've done on the website. So this again might pick up on certain themes that you'd like to explore. All the talks are from researchers who are experts in their field. You can see some of them there. So that's all I had to say, and I'll just quickly stop sharing my screen now. So in the minutes we've got left then, I'm just really keen to tackle a couple of the key comments that have come up. I think the one I'd really like to perhaps pose to our panelists are, you know, given the restrictions that we know are likely to be in place for schools, so things around, you know, these bubbles that people might have that children might need to be within, the need to restrict physical contact between perhaps school staff and children. I don't know if you can offer any thoughts as to how, for example, perhaps school staff can offer that feeling of a safe environment and the reassurance within those restrictions. So it's a really tricky one. Perhaps I'll go to you first, Tamsin. Yeah, if you'd like to.
I think it is a really tricky one, and I think we all need to go gently on ourselves and children, because they will get it wrong, and it's not necessarily the end of the world. It is, I find it really hard not to shake hands with people. I find it really hard when I see people out and about, you know, who I know well, who I'd normally go up and hug. It's instinctual. That said, we need to try and deal with this, but I think be gentle with children who get it wrong. And then I would perhaps, as a staff group, think of some alternatives that you can suggest. So for shaking hands, people have talked about elbow bumps or, you know, a namaste. I think don't worry so much about reassurance, because it's not just physical, it's tone of voice, it's what you say. You know, there's lots you can do which will help children feel calm. And I think having some clear rules that, you know, maybe a little infographic with what you would like children to do goes home. Maybe it's on the classroom wall, you know, maybe it's everywhere, and you go through it with the children. It's not easy. It won't be easy for any of us. We will all occasionally get it wrong, but just having clear alternatives. I think what can be really useful is having a feelings board. maybe by the door, that as children come in, they can indicate how they're feeling inside. Might be helpful because it will flag up to you who might be feeling a bit wobbly. It's not easy, and I do really wish you luck, but you know, just trying to have some alternatives, make sure the parents know what they are, and explaining them repeatedly in different ways to the children is the way to go, I think.
Brilliant. I'm going to go to Polly next, if that's okay. But if you, the experts that are joining us as participants, if you have any suggestions on this, then please do share them in the chat box with all attendees, because I'm sure you've got some brilliant ideas. But Polly, would you like to chip in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess one of the points that's important is a point that Tamsin made earlier, which is children are pretty resilient and most are pretty robust and will cope fine with it. So it's just, you know, not overly worrying that everyone's going to be really stressed by this. But of course, there will be some that are. And I think for those, it's about preparing them as much as you possibly can. You know, from a parent's point of view, it might be about having those conversations about going back to school and sort of gently preparing them, especially if you've got a child who may have an autistic spectrum disorder or other things, you know, getting the uniform out, planning it, having a, you know, visual chart on your wall of this is what's going to be happening this week. You're going to be in school these days, this day you might not be, what this is going to look like, and having those conversations early doors to kind of prepare them for it. Maybe starting to think about what's going to be enjoyable and exciting about going back to school to sort of engender, so, you know, some positive feelings rather than trying to feel too worried about it. And then I think for schools, you've got so little time if you're aiming to get back on the 1st of June. You know, give yourselves a break. Ideally, you might get, you know, lots of lovely information out, but that just might not be realistic at this point in time. So I think it's just about having a plan for day one. Things will change, even, you know, over the first week, and it's about being adaptable. But, you know, early on that first day, having an opportunity with young people to sort of talk about what's going to be the same, what's going to be different, what it will look like, what they've got that they can look forward to, so that they're as prepped as they can be, because there are so many things we have no control over at the moment, but there are some things that we do. So, you know, I think trying to focus on the things that we do have control of. And in relation to the COVID worries, clearly that is a concern for some of the young people going back to school. We can't guarantee they won't get it. There are no risks, you know, there's always risks associated. So it's about just focusing on the things you can do, the hand washing, the social distancing, the other things within school and outside school, but also, again, providing accurate information about the risks. And again, I think I totally agree with Tamsin. I think just not being overly harsh, you know, in the way, you know, we will all mess up, and we just have to be kind to and compassionate to ourselves and each other when we mess up, and accept that, you know, it's just going to be a work in progress.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. Some really good suggestions coming in on the chat box here, which we will share. Fran, what would you add?
I think I would add about just being honest, and certainly with the younger children. I know a head teacher who's written to parents saying there's no way I can socially distance them, you know, and it's this is what I'm doing, but it's going to be your choice how you feel about that. And I think a lot of schools are also kind of visualizing what things will look like. So children may not be in their own classroom, they may not have their own teacher, but any kind of virtual tours around the school beforehand, so they know what to expect when they go back, particularly again for the younger ones. They may not be with their friends. You know, ideally, I'm sure teachers would want to group them in a certain way, but there are so many practicalities to consider that that's probably not going to be possible. But maybe with older year groups who may not be going back straight away, there's more time to do some of those things. Yeah,
so definitely a thread there around the preparation and being honest and about what to expect. But I think there's a real theme, I think, coming up through here about also getting the children and the students involved themselves, you know, so they like to be very creative about how we can adjust to this new normal, and perhaps suggest some ideas we haven't thought of. So that's a really good idea. So thanks for everyone who's sharing their suggestions here. Really, really helpful. So I think because of the time we've got, I'm going to actually now kind of wrap up the session, and I want to go to I'd like to invite you as our participants to please, you know, let us know any final thoughts you have, any points you're taking away or questions you're going to kind of continue to think about. But I'd like to invite our panelists really to just leave us with any final thoughts. There seems to be in the chat a kind of real feel of, okay, we really agree with the principles and kind of what we need to do, but it's the question of how, which I think is on everyone's minds. So I might set that challenge to you. I don't know if you want to kick off. Maybe I'll go to you first, Fran. What would you want to leave our participants with?
I completely understand that people want the practical, advice. What do we do? And it is just such a challenge. And every school is different. Every cohort, every family, everyone's different. I think my biggest ask would just be flexibility and working with parents, listening to parents, believing parents if they say their child is anxious. And really, I'm hoping that we can move to something where online is a much more permanent complement to being in school, which is going to suit a lot of children. The only other thing I would say is that in terms of children with SEND, I think a lot of parents will be worried because of the relaxing of some of those laws. So I think extra reassurance that the right support will be in place is going to go a long way to helping trust relationships. That's I think key.
Brilliant, thanks, Fran. And perhaps go to you next, Tamsin. Any final thoughts?
Yes, I totally echo what Fran has said. I think I'd like to reassure people this. We come up in the behavioural management world against this all the time, with people wanting special techniques to handle the really tricky customers, the kids who are really challenging. And actually, it's often more of the same. And I think it's an anxiety thing. And so what I'd like to say to you all is you're all experts in your own context. As Fran said, every school context, every child is different, but you know your pupils, you know your staff, and it's more of the same. And somebody I noticed said kindness is key. And I think, let's be kind to ourselves, our staff and our pupils. And the final thing I would say, somebody else says safety is paramount. It is, but we'll never eliminate risk completely. So we can only do what we can do, and we're right to plan for it. But I think most children are going to be fine. And most of us are going to cope well. And very few children so far have got COVID. So, compared to the number killed in car accidents, we manage that risk is what I'm saying. So it's up to us to manage it as well as we can. We'll never eliminate it, but we should do more of what we know works.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Tamsin, for that. And finally to you, Polly.
I would just reinforce everything that's said. I think all the things that we're suggesting are things that you're probably doing anyway. I think give yourselves a break, have a few days of settling in. Don't do anything too dramatic. Just do a bit of watchful waiting over that time. You'll have a lot on your plate just managing the practical concerns. So I think, let the children reconnect. For the primary school ones particularly, really reinforce all the social stuff, the play. Just get yourself sorted over a period of time and keep your eye out for anyone that you think, appears to be excessively worrying in a way that's interfering, and just track them over the first couple of weeks. So I think how things might be on day one might be very different to how they are down the line. So I think those would be the kind of main things I would really focus in on. Where things like bereavement are an issue, use organisations like Winston's Wish. They have some great school resources. So just look for areas where you might feel that you need a bit more support, and those resources are out there.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. And we will absolutely share some of the links that have come up in other webinars, but also today. There's been some brilliant ideas and suggestions in the chat box and in the Q&A box here, so we'll do that. And I think there's a lovely kind of sentiment that's come up here, which is that one of the main things would be trying to enable everyone working in schools to have a restful and restorative half term. Which is, I think we could all echo that point very warmly. But thank you so much to Tamsin, to Fran, to Polly for joining us today and sharing your research and your thoughts with us so generously. Thank you also to Andre for the Mental Health for hosting us and sharing everything on YouTube. And just to echo that the recording of the whole webinar and also the individual talks will be will be available on our website and also on the Mental Health YouTube channel. Yeah, let's keep the conversation going, because lots of questions still there. But thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you very much.